So the next section we're going to look at is impulse control disorders. So it might seem a little bit strange. We're jumping a good bit advanced in the DSM, but I want to talk about all the disorders that you see primarily in childhood first, before we move on to disorders that you see across the lifespan. Now, let me start by saying that I'm not suggesting that you can not diagnose these in children. That may be true to some degree, but we're going to talk about who you can diagnose these with, but these are primarily seen in kids. So these start on page 461 of the DSM. It's a longer named chapter: disruptive, impulse control, and conduct disorders. And I think it's in a way named that because they couldn't think of anything better to tie all the pieces together. So these are disorders that are strongly behavioral in nature, meaning that there are some specific behaviors that have to be present. So this is less in the cognitive and emotional realm and more in a behavioral realm. And some people actually like that. They think it makes it easier to diagnose them because it can be a little bit like clearer behavior to observe and then to check the boxes off. So I want to start by looking at the first one on 462, oppositional defiant disorder. So this is a disorder that we have historically seen primarily diagnosed in boys. We are seeing an increase in the diagnosis within girls, which probably speaks to some cultural shifts that we're seeing around gender and gender role behavior. Because as you read this, you might find yourself thinking that some of this does feel particularly male gendered in how it's described. So if you look at criteria a pattern of angry, irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, or vindictiveness. So there's sort of three broad conceptual pieces to ODD, or oppositional defiant disorder: irritable, angry mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, and vindictiveness. So those are your three big categories. You have to see these behaviors at least 6 months. A lot of that is because if somebody is adjusting to some kind of change that goes on, we know that they may act irritably or angrily, so we want to make sure that there's a bit of a time period where these behaviors have been seen consistently. And you have to have at least 4 of the 8 symptoms they have listed in the DSM from any of the categories, and it has to be seen during an interaction with someone that's not a sibling. So I guess that's a different conversation maybe about why siblings are precluded from this. I have 2 sisters, so I think I understand why. So you have the 3 categories: angry, irritable, and then there you have 3 symptoms: loses temper, is often touchy or easily annoyed, and is often angry and resentful. So those are your 3 criteria there. The second one is argumentative, defiant behavior, which is sort of where it gets its name from. Often argues with authority figures or for children, adolescents, with adults in general. Actively defies or refuses to comply with requests from authority figures or with the rules. Often deliberately annoys others and often blames others for his or her mistakes or behavior. So, my sense is just thinking about those traits, and those are kind of the hallmark traits of ODD because those are what I think of as actively defying types of behaviors. And then lastly is vindictiveness. So has been spiteful or vindictive at least twice in the past 6 months. So it's a pretty clear set of behavioral standards to make a diagnosis. You have to see at least 4 of those. And it makes a note here about how can you distinguish between what is developmentally normative and even what is, they use a phrase, within normal limits. So when I think about that, I think about how much behavior we culturally and even statistically think of as occurring within normal limits. So this is not suggesting that kids who disobey sometimes, or kids who can be emotional, kids who are like easily like temperamental. It doesn't suggest that those children have this. In fact, you want to really think about developmental context. You also want to think about temperament, because some people just have, what sort of the old school categorization was called the difficult temperamental style, which is a real thing. It is physiologically determined, so it's in our genetics. So I also think it's always wise to sort of ask questions about the parents, the birth parents, particularly if you have that data. Because if you can see a long set of history from the birth parents engaging in like very temperamental behavior, that might suggest to you it's temperamental in nature and not as much as it is an active oppositional position. So just be mindful of that if you can get that data diagnostically when you're looking at that. It also tells you that, look at the age, because the age matters in how you want to think about this. So if kids are under 5, this should occur on most days for at least 6 months. For people 5 and older, it should occur at least once a week for at least 6 months. And so those are guidelines. They also go on to tell you that you should also consider things like the intensity of the behavior. So maybe you just saw it once or twice in 6 months, but the outburst was so extreme in intensity that it feels out of normal limits both times that it occurred. So you also want to make sure that it's associated with some kind of distress in their immediate social context, and that it's impacting their behavior or their functioning at school or work or in jobs or socially, and that it's not due to some other mental disorder. If someone's having psychosis, if someone's actively depressed, you would not make this diagnosis if you think that these behaviors are a result of those disorders. If you only see it in one setting, we give that a mild specifier. So if this is only happening at home, but teachers are saying, nope, your kid's an angel. Daycare workers are saying, nope, kid's an angel. Observers in Walmart are saying, wow, you got great kids. We give a mild specifier. If it's in 2 settings, moderate. If it's 3 or more settings, so if it's in all places, a severe specifier. And there's some really great data. For sake of time, a video, I'm not going to say much more about it, but there's some great data in the section of the DSM about when you should usually see it, when does it begin. Certainly preschool sort of era is when you typically see this developmentally happen. And this is another diagnosis that I think people, to be fair, I think there's some armchair psychology that goes on with this diagnosis. I hear a lot of people who are mental health techs in residential facilities who are really quick to label a kid who is not obeying or listening with this label. And so, because a lot of you guys will probably early in your career work in those kinds of settings, especially if you like children, I would say be very thoughtful about going through the criteria, making sure you're seeing enough of them in enough places, enough times over a period of time before you come to that decision. In particular, because this is a label that, when someone says, my child has oppositional defiant disorder, the name of the disorder alone puts the receiver of the information at an automatic sort of, ooh, wow, your kid just doesn't ever listen or obey, right? So it carries something with it that's pretty negative. So you want to be just really certain about that, and you want to rule out other psychiatric issues. That's a criteria in every single disorder. You've seen that so far in everything we've studied. Make sure it's not better accounted for by drugs or another mental illness. I think that's especially true in this disorder. Depressed children, anxious children, traumatized children will often behave in ways that look oppositional in nature, but it's actually a manifestation of the trauma. So this is where case conceptualizing, which is probably a term you guys are just beginning to think about. In fact, maybe that is a term, maybe it's going to come up more in this course and over the next couple of semesters. But as you're thinking about the case and how you make sense of the individual, you want to be very thoughtful about understanding where you think symptoms are generated from. So if this is generated from a place of a desire to be oppositional or defiant in an individual, this is the right diagnosis. But if these behaviors are only occurring because somebody's traumatized, and if that trauma wouldn't have existed, or their trauma response got resolved, if these were to go away, you want to think about which one of these disorders do I really think is existing. Sort of a thing to start thinking about. It's also probably one of the hardest parts of diagnosis, to be fair. On 466 is intermittent explosive disorder. Probably one of the most, I think, misunderstood diagnoses. You don't see it often. I think people are really hesitant to make this diagnosis. I think the naming of it is part of the reason why. It is, to be fair, a strange named diagnosis. Intermittent explosive disorder. It's kind of it sort of sounds like, oh, so just sometimes, occasionally, you explode on me. And the answer is, sort of, but sort of what the diagnosis is. So again, make sure you're following the criteria. When you look at A, you've got A1 and A2. You need to have one or the other. You don't have to have both. So recurrent behavioral outbursts representing a failure to control aggressive impulses manifested by either verbal aggression, so that can be temper tantrums, or physical aggression toward property, animals, other people, that occurs twice a week on average for at least 3 months. And the physical aggression does not result in damage or destruction of property and does not result in physical injury to animals or other individuals. So you might be saying physical aggression toward things that doesn't result in damage or destruction of property. So um, the what you're thinking about here is that this is emotionally driven, not behaviorally driven. So I'm just so angry and I'm so mad that I just start pounding the desk, right? Probably not going to harm the desk when I do that or harm my own hands. Or I'm so angry that when I walk away from the swing set, I just push a little kid from the swing, right? Again, not aimed at really harming the child. It's actually just aggression manifesting itself. The second criteria, 3 behavioral outbursts involving damage or destruction of property and or physical assault involving physical injury against animals or other people within a 12-month period of time. So within 3 months, actually, this is the situation where they actually do hit the kid on the swing because they're mad at the kid, or they throw the cat intentionally against the wall because they're so angry. So you'd have one or both of those. The magnitude of aggressiveness expressed during the recurrent outburst is grossly out of proportion to the provocation or the precipitating psychosocial stressors. So example, provocation. The cat is sitting next to you, and it's like rubbing up against you. You know how cats do that thing, where, right, to get love and affection. So the cat's just doing that. It won't stop. And instead of either physically moving yourself or moving the cat away, you throw the cat. Right? That would be a disproportionate to the provocation, or out of proportion to the precipitating psychosocial stressor. So your boss tells you like, "Hey, I'm gonna need you to really just focus a little more at work, pay a little better attention next couple of weeks, okay?" Right? They kind of give you, not glowing feedback, but nothing that's really forcing anything, anything that's overly threatening. And yet you walk out the front door and you kick the car in the parking lot next to you and you punch your own car door and you slam your door shut, and right, that's out of proportion to the stressor going on in that moment. The recurrent aggressive outbursts are not premeditated. This is really important. This is actually one of the critical components that differentiates this from the next disorder we're going to talk about, which is no premeditation. This is just, I am so angry, I'm feeling so much negative psychological energy right now that it's just going to come out at something, right? So it's not premeditated. You weren't thinking like, today later, I think I will kick my car, right? Something like that. And they're not committed to achieve a tangible object. So this is not like you're trying to scare somebody. You're not trying to get money or power. There's no manipulation in this. This is just surely like emotional in nature. The outburst cause distress in the individual, or impairment in occupational or interpersonal functioning. So getting fired, getting sued, estrangement from your family putting you in a detention center, or something like that. At least 6 years old, and they're not better explained by another mental disorder. So again, you want to rule those things out. This can be diagnosed with other disorders when there are excessive emotional anger outbursts in addition to the disorder that's also existing. So, I think autism is a great example of that. Right? There's some aggression that you see in autism that's normal, but if they're having explosive outbursts that is just a manifestation of their emotional state, not aimed at getting a reward or a toy or because they're being disciplined, but just emotional outbursts, you could add this diagnosis too. All right, on 469. So I think we generally think of oppositional defiant disorder as the lesser severe disruptive disorder, and conduct disorder as the more severe. But I'm probably using the wrong word. Actually, severe might not be the right word. The right word actually might be like concerning in a long-term way, right? Oftentimes people with ODD, with behavior modification, can often learn to put those behaviors in check. You hear a lot of stories from adults who say like, "Oh my gosh, as a kid, like I was terrible. Like I broke the rules. I didn't listen to my parents. I behaved a fool." And as grown-ups, they're completely fine and have moved on. There is data to suggest that people who diagnosed with conduct disorder during childhood and adolescence may have a higher likelihood to continue to have serious mental illnesses as they age. And the nature of conduct disorder itself is a little bit concerning. This is a disorder where there is a malicious intent, there might be premeditation, there's a stronger psychological component, whereas ODD has a stronger behavioral component, and intermittent explosive disorder has a stronger emotional component. So conduct has a stronger psychological component. So look at criteria A on page 469. A repetitive and persistent, so it's happened over and over again over a period of time, pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate social norms or rules are violated. So it's a mouthful there. Basic rights of others, so harming somebody, hurting someone, stealing from someone, or major age-appropriate social norms or rules are being violated. So they are behaving in ways that are strange, dangerous, unusual given their age and development, as manifested by the presence of at least 3 of the following 15 criteria in the past 12 months from any of the categories, with at least 1 present in the past 6 months. So you have 15 options here. You have to have 3 of them in the past year, 1 of them in the past 6 months. So the timeline's important. Keep that in your head. Aggression to people or animals is section 1. Bullying, threatening, intimidating, initiating fights, has used a weapon that can seriously harm somebody, has been physically cruel to people, has been physically cruel to animals, has stolen while confronting a victim, and has forced someone into sexual activity. It's a pretty concerning list of behaviors. Destruction of property, section 2, has deliberately engaged in fire setting with the intention of causing serious damage. So this is not like a compulsively driven pyromaniac. This is a desire to harm things or people, or things and people. Has deliberately destroyed others' property other than a fire setting, so like breaking someone's TV, breaking someone's windows, puncturing someone's car tires. Section 3 is deceit or trust or theft. Has broken into someone's home, building a car, often lies to obtain goods or favors to avoid obligations, so like pulling off a con. Has stolen items of non-trivial value without confronting a victim, so like shoplifting or breaking and entering. And the last section is serious violation of the rules, so stays out at night despite parental prohibitions, has run away from home overnight at least twice while living with the parents or parental surrogate home without returning home, and is often truant from school, and this is beginning before age 13. So that's a lot, and you need to see this. You need to see this have developmental roots, meaning that if this just begins in adulthood, you're probably looking at a different disorder. In fact, it even gives you a note that it even talks about something called antisocial personality disorder. That's an adult disorder, and so we won't cover that in this class, but recognize that this often can lead to a diagnosis of antisocial personality later in life. You do specify if it's adolescent onset, childhood onset, or if you don't know when the onset is. And there's also a specifier about limited prosocial emotions. So if that's a new term to you, a prosocial emotion or behavior is an emotion or behavior that is meant to be helpful to other people, even at your own, with no reward back for yourself, right? So cooperation, sharing, empathy, caring, jumping out of your car when you see a dog on the highway, even though it might actually harm you, right? So that's the idea of prosocial behavior. So the specifier of with limited prosocial behavior is suggesting that individuals here must have displayed at least 2 of the following characteristics persistently over 12 months within multiple relationships and multiple settings, and they anyways, they sort of just tell you that that's concerning. But those are lack of remorse or guilt. So they kill the cat and they don't feel bad about killing the cat. Callousness or a lack of empathy. So they don't have any sense of concern for their victim. Unconcerned about performance. So if this is manifesting itself as bad school and work performance, they don't really care. And shallow or deficient affect. So these kids often will read as cold or distant. That's a lack of emotional expressiveness. We call that the affect of somebody. So shallow affect means they're not deficient affect means they're showing none, and shallow means that they might, oh my gosh, your cat, and then walk away smiling. Right, it's sort of like a shallow affect. And then you make a specifier of severity based on the criteria outlined for you. So if you're having a strong reaction to this, listening to me talk about it, reading it in your DSM, that seems fair. These are a set of pretty serious problems and serious issues, and certainly when you see these in a young person, it raises a lot of concern, right? So this is not just about an emotionally easily irritable, can't contain their anger. This is not an anger management issue. This is not an actively like, screw you, mom and dad, I'm going to do what I want to do, defiance. This is really aimed at harming people and sort of a general lack of respect for the day-to-day functioning of humanity, which is scary to see an individual. Make sure you read this section. It's really interesting, and read the rule outs in particular. But just for sake of time, I want to look at the last couple. On 476, these are really, really specific. You have Pyromania, which I actually referenced earlier. So these are people who deliberately and purposely set fire. Has to happen on more than one occasion. There has to be some kind of arousal before the act. They call it tension or affective arousal. So it's sort of like an itch, an itch that really needs to be scratched. And then a fascination with, or interest in, or curiosity about, or attraction to fire, and its situational contexts. So how it's used, what happens when you burn things, that kind of thing. And then for that tension that exists before the lighting of the fire, there is a gratification, a release that happens during or after the fire, whether they're watching it or participating in it. And then it's not done for monetary gain. If you're setting fires because you want to get insurance money out of that, that is not a obsession or a psychological need to be with fire. That is a intent to deceive people and to exploit a system. So it's more common in a conduct disorder, not in a pyromaniac. It's also not to express anger or vengeance. It's not to make your situation better in life. It's not as a result of hallucinations or delusions or someone saying, do it, burn it down. This is really just about a fire-specific impulse control disorder. And then kleptomania on 478. So this has to do with stealing. Recurrent failure to resist impulses to steal objects that are not needed for personal use or monetary value. That is the real differentiator between a kleptomaniac and then someone stealing for other kinds of reasons. Kleptomaniacs will just steal anything. It is the drive and desire to steal. They're not stealing that lipstick that they really, really want but can't afford. They're just stealing. This is going to be really embarrassing, people. This is your reward for watching a long video. Like, if a hot glue gun happens to be laying around, don't judge me or ask questions, they just steal it. Even though they have no need for a hot glue gun or anything with a hot glue gun, they just take it because it's there. So it's about an urge to steal, not about gain or profit. They're not going to sell it later. Again, there's the tension and build up before they do it. There's the pleasurable release after they do it. And this is not about vengeance or anger or I'm doing it because daddy doesn't love me. This is about an impulse. It's an impulse control disorder, an impulse they cannot fight. There's the other specified category, so look through that to see what it might look like if you don't have enough evidence to have a full-blown disorder. And so, for example, maybe you haven't had the time frames met for oppositional defiant disorder, but you think given 3 more months you'll meet it or something like that. And then the unspecified category exists as well. Interesting disorders, again, almost always seen before 18 years of age. It'd be very unusual or rare to diagnose this after that, with the exception, in my opinion, of intermittent explosive disorder. that is something that you might see for the first time in adults. So be mindful of that.